Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I would like to welcome you to the lecture series for World History 1. Today's lecture is going to be over a very long and very important or significant movement within the medieval period, which is commonly referred to as the Crusades, or the Crusading movement. Now, if you remember on our previous lecture, the Medieval Church Lecture 1, we kind of broke that lecture in the middle to take a break from papal history and to specifically focus upon the Crusades, because that became, for the medieval papacy, one of the main examples of that papal power and authority that we were talking about. Now, it's important to remember, or to put the context of this movement in terms of a larger kind of context of medieval church history. If you remember when we talked about the medieval church, starting in the 900s, what we see a beginning of reform movements that are going to elevate the power of the papacy. And the Crusades are best probably kind of exemplified, or best kind of viewed as being part of that reform movement that the church was actually undergoing in the 900s and 1000s and 1100s. Now, in particularly, the Crusades became a reform movement not for the church itself, but actually for European society. And so, the origins of the Crusading movement date all the way back in terms of Christian theology to the time period of the mid to late 400s AD or CE. And we relate that back to a theologian or to a Christian thinker by the name of Augustine, or Saint Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine argued for the first time in Christian theology and Christian doctrine that war could actually be just. And that might take a little bit of explaining. Originally, the idea of Christianity was centered around love and also pacifism. And so the earliest Christians were actually they did not engage in the military, and they did not engage in terms of war. So that lasted for a couple of centuries. And then as time went on and Christianity became more mainstream and more widespread, the ideas of what war was and the theology and philosophy behind war began to change. And Augustine of Hippo, in fact, kind of coined the term just war and argued that in certain circumstances, not all, but in certain circumstances, it was actually morally obligational for Christians to actually protect life and to protect each other. And so that idea of just war is where this idea of the Crusades comes from. Now, we got to be careful because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding about the Crusades. The only thing that I can really say, having myself being a Crusade scholar, is that one has to keep in mind that for the time period, Christians believed that by engaging in the Crusades, they were actually accomplishing spiritual matters. They were doing something spiritual that could equate, or that could, result in spiritual rewards. And where that idea came from is point number 2. It's called the idea of pilgrimage and the indulgence. Now, we might all know what a pilgrimage is. It's, of course, a spiritual journey. But in the Christian church in the medieval period, and even to this day, there's an understanding of something called an indulgence. And what the indulgence is it's a reward for doing something holy or spiritual, according to the Christian church or Christian tradition, that could then lessen one's time in purgatory. The idea of Christian sin is that when a person sins, they in fact gain 2 punishments. They gain a punishment of having damaged their relationship with God, but they also get a punishment in what is called being kept in a place called purgatory. And so the idea was that when you go to confession, you get the reward of getting your relationship with God repaired, and you get grace, but you still retain that punishment of some kind of timed period in purgatory. And that's where the indulgence came in. The idea of the indulgence was that if you got an indulgence, you could remove part of your time in purgatory. And in fact, there was something called a plenary or a full indulgence that would remove all of your time in purgatory up until the point you started to sin again. And that plenary indulgence actually was very rare. In the medieval world, you could primarily only get that plenary indulgence by making a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you remember back to our lecture on Islam, we mentioned the Pact of Umar and that there was a church built on the site of the Christian traditional belief of the resurrection. And that church, called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was a pilgrimage place that all Christians could attend and gain this plenary indulgence. Now, there were a few other ways to get a plenary indulgence, but this was the most common and the most used by medieval Christians. And so, what the Crusade movement did in its original format was it kind of took the idea of pilgrimage and the idea of the indulgence, and it merged it with the concept or the theory of the just war. Now, how that occurred is actually a step-by-step process. Part of this reform movement that we mentioned in the 900s and 1000s was also an attempt to kind of remove the violence of medieval society. And as you look on the outline there, you see two things. You see the Pax Dei, which is called the peace of God, and you see the Truga Dei, which was called the truce of God. Now, the peace of God was an agreement that the church got all nobles to agree on, was that they would not wage war or have fights on Sundays, because that day was the Lord's Day, according to Christian tradition, and the idea was that you shouldn't really kill anybody on Sunday. Now, the Truga Dei took that idea one step further, and it argued that there were certain major holidays or feast days of the Christian church that you should also not engage in war in. And that the idea behind this was not only to kind of keep these days sacred, but also, because of their number, to try and limit the amount of days that people could actually fight on. Now, in terms of the peace of God, there's 52 weeks in a year, so there'd be 52 days you couldn't fight on. But in terms of major feast days, those major feast days, in terms of, feast days like Christmas, they could fall during the middle of the week or any time in the week. And if they did, then the idea was not to fight during those days. Now, if you total all those days up, what you'll actually find is that the peace of God and the Truga Dei, peace of God and the truce of God, eliminated more than half the year for fighting. And so the church was actually trying to limit the violence and control it. And the third step kind of in this process was actually the crusade. If you couldn't stop people from fighting, then turn that violence and turn that militarization towards a spiritual goal. And that's what the Crusades, at least in theory, were trying to do. Now, before we leave this slide, there's something here called the Reconquista. And what this refers to is the warfare that took place off and on from 1050 until 1492 between the Muslims in Spain and Christians in both Iberia, Spain, and in the border areas of France. Now, originally the Reconquista was not considered a crusade, but as time went on, it was actually lumped into this idea of the crusading movement, and the indulgence was in fact applied. But it is important to remember that this is going to set the stage for a down the road problem for the Christian church. Once they started to kind of tinker with the mechanics of the indulgence, kind of removing it from pilgrimage and applying it to crusading, that's when we begin to see corruption and inconsistencies develop in the practice of the indulgence idea. And when that occurs, as you might know from your reading or from history, one of the big causes of the Protestant Reformation was an abuse on the indulgences. In fact, particularly the sale of indulgences, which originally got its start in connection with the crusading movement. So this change made by the church in the 1000s was not necessarily a great change. It was not necessarily a beneficial change for the church long term. But it did, in fact, produce a number of significant events that we'll kind of talk about. Now, just to let you know, there are basically 9 numbered crusades. And we're not going to take the time to try to go through all of them. Recently there's been a lot of talk about the Crusades in relation to Christian and Muslim relations, or East-West relations. Now, the one thing I do want to say is that for most of the Muslim world, the Crusades were like a blip in history. And what I mean by that is they were a series of contests between the Christians and the Muslims that the Christians, in fact, only won one of them. So in terms of, if you were placing this in like a record for a sports event, the Christians were 1-8 when it comes to Crusades. And because of that, the Muslim world, at least during the medieval period, did not really equate the Crusades to an aggressive event or to a persecution, if you will, by the West. That rhetoric and those kinds of ideas were only introduced in the post-1900 period of world history. They might get a lot of talk and a lot of discussion today, but 500 years ago, the Crusades represented a triumph for the Muslim world, not necessarily, and a defeat of the Christian world, not an aggressive ploy by the Christians to kind of, spread their religion or to basically take over the Middle East. Now, if we take a look at the Crusades, if you see this map here, you'll notice that a lot of the major Crusades, the first Crusades, did in fact go to Jerusalem. But over time, as you can see here, they began to target Egypt, and by the end, they were targeting up here the city of Tunis, which is just off the coast of basically Sicily. Now, as you can see, this map kind of illustrates the increasing problems of the Crusade movement and its decay and kind of diversion away from what it was doing originally. Now, if we take a look at major Crusades, obviously the first one we want to talk about is the First Crusade. And the First Crusade started out in a very weird way. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Muslims in a major battle called the Battle of Manzikert. And in that battle, the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor, was actually killed. And in the aftermath of that major loss, the Byzantine Empire actually sent a letter to the papacy asking for aid. But if you'll notice the date, 1071, that letter arrived right on the eve of the start of the investiture controversy, in which the papacy had its own problems to deal with. And as a result, the call for aid from the Eastern Roman Empire largely went ignored for about 20 years. Eventually, a pope by the name of Pope Urban II decided to take up that idea of helping the East, as well as kind of protecting Christians who were traveling to Jerusalem. And so he called what's called the Council of Clermont in France, and he put out the request to major lords to go ahead and sign up and send troops to liberate to basically create a safe passage and road for the Christians trying to go on pilgrimage. Now, a little bit of background. In 1062, a new Muslim power by the name of the Seljuk Turks had risen to power and actually conquered Jerusalem. And unfortunately, they did not adhere to the Pact of Umar. They were persecuting and killing Christians who were going to the Holy Land on crusade, rather than keeping Jerusalem a neutral city, as we kind of talked about. And it was these reports of persecution and murdering of Christians that actually sparked the idea of the First Crusade, and that connection between the idea of the just war and the merging with that idea of pilgrimage. Now, long story short, the First Crusade was extremely detailed. It's extremely long. It lasted 4 years. It has some very negative aspects of it. The first wave of the Crusade, if you notice there, we talk about 2 waves. The first wave was carried out by poor people, led by a few nobles, who were out to make a buck. And as a result, this first wave primarily targeted Jews and Muslims on the way to the Holy Land. And as a result, that first wave is kind of where the Crusades first got their first big negative kind of connotation and image. The second wave, which was organized and carried out by the members and leaders that had attended the Council of Clermont, that crusade was actually very successful and eventually resulted in the creation of a stable Middle East area for the Christians to actually travel through and to actually make their pilgrimage. So the First Crusade was successful. But as an offshoot of that crusade, as an unforeseen circumstance or result, what was created in the Middle East were city-states that were commonly referred to as the Crusader states, or on the outline, what is called by the French term, outre-mer, across the sea. And so what developed over time with these Crusader states, because they lacked a population to draw people from, what developed was military orders within the Christian church to kind of support those. And those military orders, listed as they are, were the Knights of St. John of the Hospital and the Knights of the Temple, or the Templar Knights. And those are the knights that most people are familiar with, because there's a lot of mystery and a lot of kind of strange stories that surround them. So the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, gets the whole Crusade movement going, and it is a smashing success. It conquers the city of Jerusalem, it liberates Jerusalem, and establishes these city-states or colonial states in the Middle East. Now, I do recommend reading through the Crusades if this is a topic that interests you. There's a lot of great stories and a lot of great information and just a lot of strange things going on in the Crusades as well. But for the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and kind of bulk down. The Second Crusade was the first crusade to be unsuccessful. It was also the first crusade to be led by two kings of Europe, Conrad III and Louis VII of France. Now, the Third Crusade was a draw, if you will. The great Muslim leader Saladin could not defeat Richard the Lionheart, who ultimately took control of the Third Crusade, but Richard the Lionheart could also not defeat him. And as a result, the Third Crusade is at best a loss for the Christians, or at worst, a loss for the Christians, and at best, kind of a draw. Now, the interesting thing about the Third Crusade is that at one point, Richard the Lionheart, by a lot of historians considered to be one of the greatest medieval kings and examples of medieval knighthood in the Middle Ages, he challenged Saladin to a one-on-one combat. And he actually wound up wounding Saladin so bad that Saladin would eventually die from his wounds. But unfortunately, Richard the Lionheart gave up the crusade before Saladin died and wound up going home, having signed a truce with Saladin rather than being able to gain a victory. Now, the important thing about the Third Crusade is that it's at this point that the ideal of crusading shifted to begin to focus on Egypt. Egypt was Saladin's power base. And Richard argued, when he came back from the Third Crusade, that it was essential for the Western world, it was essential for the Christians to knock out the power base of Egypt if they hoped to make lasting gains in terms of holding Jerusalem. And so that's why, if we take a look at the next slide, the Fourth Crusade and the Fifth Crusade both targeted Egypt. And both, the Fourth Crusade wound up never attacking the Muslims. It actually only attacked the city of Constantinople, which is a very weird kind of story that is very complex and we don't have time to go through in this lecture. And the Fifth Crusade wound up being largely successful early, but then ultimately being a failure and strengthening the power of the Sultan of Egypt, or that Egyptian power base. Now, after the Fifth Crusade, we begin to see what are called quasi-crusades, or very weak attempts at crusading later on. And these quasi-crusades are called quasi-crusades because they don't actually ever go to Jerusalem or try to engage in that idea of getting to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in order to get that crusading indulgence. The Albigensian Crusade is a crusade fought in southern France against heretics. It is primarily led by Simon de Montfort first, who was a northern noble of France, and it's later actually carried out and ran by the French monarchy as an attempt to kind of consolidate its power. The Children's Crusade is not really a crusade at all. It's basically an event in which a bunch of children, ages basically 10 to 14, got together and decided to march to the Mediterranean Sea, believing, according to their leader, that the Mediterranean Sea would part and they would begin to walk to Egypt and conquer Egypt through love. Now, the Baltic Crusades relate to Eastern Europe, and they are crusades against a group of people known as the Wends and the Slavs, who were non-Christian. And then last but not least, we have the Crusades of Frederick II and the two Crusades of King Louis IX, otherwise known as Saint Louis of France. Now, in terms of the importance of the crusading movement, it cannot be understated just how important the crusading movement was. The crusading movement did so much to kind of jumpstart Europe back on the track towards kind of consolidation and power and technological innovation. So if we take a look at the effects of the crusade, what we see is first and foremost, the increase of papal authority. Only popes could call crusades. And in fact, the crusades, beginning with the first, which had about 13,000 troops, and culminating in the third crusade, which had about 44,000 knights and soldiers, they represent the largest armies ever put together in the medieval period. The average size of a king's army was about 10,000 knights and soldiers. And the papacy was able to put together armies of at least that size, if not triple that size or quadruple that size, by the time of the Fourth Crusade. And so, these crusades represented a major jump in papal authority. The Reform movement was already moving towards that, and the crusades only kind of kick-started and really piled on that ability of the papacy to enforce its will. Now, this is kind of weird and might be hard to understand, but the crusading movement was an opportunity for lay people, that's non-church clergy. It was a way for lay people to demonstrate their religious dedication. Most of the people that went on crusade not to get rich, but in fact to gain spiritual rewards. And already, when we talked about that Reform movement, one of the ways that the elite, kind of got that spiritual reward was by creating monasteries and retiring at monasteries. Well, after the Reform movement of the Cluniacs in 909, and then the investiture controversy and the continuing Reform movements of the later 10th and 11th centuries, the lay people looked for a new way, and the Crusades kind of represented that for them. Now, in terms of economy, having the creation of colonial states in the Middle East reconnected Europe with Middle Eastern and, in fact, Asian trade. And it also brought in a period of connectivity in which the Europeans, for the first time in about 500 years, began to really trade with the rest of the world. And that trade then began to kickstart the European economy. Something that might not be realized also is that, when Rome fell, literacy fell, and all of that connection to the ancient Greek writers, that Greek philosophy that we talked about earlier in the semester, all of that learning was kind of lost. However, it was lost to the Western world, but it was not lost to the Muslim world. And in fact, the Muslim world had continued to build off of that great philosophical, intellectual tradition of the Greeks, and had continued to push medicine and science even further. And when the Europeans basically created these colonial states in the Middle East, as well as having increased interaction with the Muslims on a political nature, a political scale, what happened was very simply, the Europeans learned Arabic, and they began to kind of translate Arabic documents, which contained Greek information and Greek learning. They began to translate those back into the Western world, which kind of reconnected the Western world to Greek learning and provided the catalyst that created a intellectual event that we'll talk about a little later, which is called the Renaissance. Last but not least, one of the major effects of the crusading movement was that it did in fact accomplish the goal of the papacy in trying to control that violence. The exportation of European violence and population to the Middle East did in fact result in an alleviation of basically populational pressures as well as political pressures that were building. Now, it didn't last and it didn't have as great of effect that it could have, because quite honestly, that problem ultimately disappeared with the outbreak of the bubonic plague, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. A catastrophic pandemic disease that wound up wiping out about 1/3 to 1/2 of the European population. And so the exportation of European violence and population did stabilize things for about 100 to 150 years, but ultimately got kind of lost in the shuffle in the wake of the outbreak of the plague. So those are our main effects of the crusading movement for Europe. Now for Islam, even though it's not located on there, one major effect that the crusading movement had for the Muslim world is that it kind of forced an idea of unity upon the Muslim world that was not realized in the 12 and 1300s, but would ultimately be realized in the 14 and 1500s under a new Muslim state that was called the Ottoman Empire. And if you jump ahead to the last lecture called The Decline of the Middle Ages, we talk about, in that lecture, we talk about the Ottoman Empire, which was founded in 1291, but actually solidified control of the Middle East from about the late 1300s, 1400s, all the way up until the end of World War I in 1918. A lot of people don't know this, but the Ottoman Empire was actually one of the enemies of the United States in World War I, and it did not survive the war. That's when it got deconstructed and broken up, and the modern Middle East was kind of created. Okay, so that's our lecture on the crusading movement. If you take a look at the last slide of the lecture, it's just a couple of pictures to kind of show you the Crusader foundations, the Crusader fortifications that were created in the Middle East during this time period by these military orders to support and kind of protect Muslims and Christians on the path of the roads. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to email me, let me know. I know it's a very complex topic. We've covered it in like 28 minutes. I would normally spend, in some classes, I spend 5 or 6 weeks on the Crusades. So I've done my best to try and condense it down for you into a palatable format. If you have questions, we have tons of resources to read more about the Crusades, and also you can always ask me. I can also give you other information and other sources to take a look at. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you again for listening to it, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.